I just hope you guys are ready to face the dancing sword.
Bring it on.
Yeah.
What's a dancing sword?
Well, it's like...
It's a sword that can fight without you holding it.
What, you just send your sword into battle for you and then you stay home? It's kind of stupid.
No, you have to be at least 3 inches away from it when it's fighting. That way you can fight 2 people at once.
It's kind of cool.
All right, welcome back, dear listeners. We are so glad you're back. We have another episode for you today where we're going to talk about how to elevate your items. But before we do that, Mark, how are you doing? Are you raising the level of your game lately?
Well, I've been on a bit of a hiatus, honestly, so I haven't been elevating my game, but that's kind of the plan in any case. I've been recharging my batteries. I got a big stroke of inspiration this last weekend, and I spent a good chunk of one of my days working away at stuff, and it was amazing how much a few weeks off can really recharge those batteries.
That's awesome. Now, when you take that time away, what do you find recharges your batteries especially?
I mean, I can just play some video games. Maybe I just wait for inspiration. Speaking of video games, Ben, you've been playing some video games a lot lately, huh?
I confess it, it's true. I've been enjoying Ghost Recon a lot. This is the Wildlands edition of that game. It's come out a few years ago, but I didn't catch it the first time through, and darn if the $5 price in the Steam Summer Sale wasn't a compelling proposition.
Oh man, that Steam Summer Sale is killing me. Like I got a backlog of games. It sounds like a Western blues song of my Steam backlog.
Are we going to get a Suno song about your Steam backlog?
Oh man, it would be a sad song, that's for sure.
It would be a sad song. All right, well, hey, let's get to our topic today, friends. We're going to talk about how to elevate your items. And, special items are an amazing way to spice up your game, and they've also got some risks associated with them, and we'll get into that today. So let's think for a moment about what these kinds of things can be. What are some examples of magical items? Mark, I know you've got some examples off the top of your head.
I'm going to go through these pretty quick, Ben. There's a lot of them.
Hit me.
We're going to run by. We got the old classic Excalibur. Doesn't get kind of like the original magic item,
Mm-hmm.
Sting from Lord of the Rings. Elric has Stormbreaker. Lightsabers, Star Wars. Can't tell me those things ain't magic. Yeah. Vera from Firefly.
Interesting choice. Good.
Yeah,
yes.
It's a special item. They're not just magic items. These are special items, guys.
Yeah.
They don't have to be magic.
They don't have to be crazy, unique, or one of a kind.
And right after I say they don't have to be magic, the next one in my list is the Elder Wand from Harry Potter.
Yeah, that is a magic item.
Yeah, it kind of is. But the neutralizer from Men in Black.
All right, that makes everybody forget when they get flashed.
Yeah, it's kind of right up there. What do you got there, Ben?
I know when I was growing up, I thought the hoverboard from Back to the Future looked amazing. Batman's utility belt and Iron Man's armor are both really great items, although for me, they also are a cover for lazy writing in the wrong hands. Oh, look, I just happen to have the right thing for this occasion,
Oh, yeah.
I also like we're going to talk about the Hattori Hanzo sword in Kill Bill.
Oh, yes, we will.
There's a couple more examples you've got. Some ancient weapons, I believe.
I mean, if you look back, Thor's hammer, Mjolnir, that's kind of an OG item if you go back to mythology.
Yep.
And currently in the Marvel Universe, Conan's Atlantean sword is kind of an iconic weapon. I don't know if that item is magical per se, but it certainly is iconic, and it is an exceptional weapon.
Well, and that's one of the things I think we think is interesting about items is that they don't have to be specially empowered. They don't have to be one-of-a-kind things that have abilities or confer abilities that none else have. But they do need to be worth keeping in mind. They're not just commodities that you trade in and out. They're not just here today, gone tomorrow, disposable things.
Hmm. And why would that be? Why would this be, Ben? Why?
Well, so items, here's what's great about great items is that they help us tell the stories we're telling. And there's a few ways that they do that, but they're usually memorable. Items are memorable because of the role they play in that story. So first of all, items can be a lot of fun in helping us define the character, right? Now, Mark, you brought up this example with the Hattori Hanzo sword from Kill Bill. Tell me what you're thinking about that and why that's a special item for you.
If you think about that movie and her character growth, it really was kind of in the certain act of the show that she gets this weapon, and this weapon kind of shows that she has had character growth. She's had some achievements, and that she's, in a sense, kind of worthy of this weapon. She has a purpose, and they wouldn't give this to her in the beginning of the movie. They need to give this to her kind of later in the show. They got to reveal it at least later in the show, how she gets this weapon, because it's important.
And Hanzo is not going to make that weapon for her. But then she says, I'm going to use this to kill Bill.
Yeah.
And Hanzo at that point, he knows this is something he needs to do because he and Bill have issues, but this is the person who's ready to do it. And she just needs some of that Japanese steel, as she says.
Yeah, they got beef.
They got big beef.
And she's going to squash it.
I think that's great. I mean, so picking this out, she's got to be worthy of that weapon. And speaking of worthy, I mean, Thor's entire shtick is he's got to be worthy to wield Mjolnir. To lift this great hammer, you've got to be worthy.
It's literally written on the weapon. In the Marvel Comics, it is.
Yeah.
So, and there's entire storylines where he kind of has to prove himself worthy for that weapon once again.
Yeah, that whole first movie in the MCU. Mm-hmm. And yeah, to your point, this happens frequently enough in the comics. Interestingly, in the comics, other people sometimes are worthy to lift the hammer and do.
That's a fair point. I think Captain America at the end of that movie, he apparently is worthy. And it's not just worthiness sometimes. We go back to like King Arthur and him having to be a rightful heir. He's the only one who can draw that sword from the stone. There could be special situations upon that character to which this weapon would be attached to.
Yeah, so it's not always necessarily about their internal journey. Sometimes it could be about their uniqueness, or in some cases it has associations because it's a certain distinctive kind of weapon. So we mentioned lightsabers earlier. If you see a lightsaber come out in the Star Wars universe, in general, you're pretty sure this is a Force user, and depending on when it is, it's probably a Jedi. And being a Jedi means that you are there presumably to defend peace and justice in the galaxy.
And notice how each one of those lightsabers are distinctive even unto themselves. You have some that have, the double blade coming out, the hilt might be different, and they each have like different colors. And now, Ben, you've been to Disney World.
I have.
And you've made a lightsaber, right?
I have.
Okay. What color is your lightsaber?
My lightsaber is blue.
You didn't go purple.
I didn't go purple. I didn't go red. I went for that kind of awesome. There was something about it that I thought, my favorite character in the Star Wars universe, the guy who I feel like even though he failed, he got it right more often than he got it wrong, was Obi-Wan Kenobi. And I felt like this was a good. It's actually uses a lot of the parts and pieces to look like that kind of lightsaber too.
And technically only one man is allowed to have the purple lightsaber apparently, and that's Samuel L. Jackson. So
only he is cool enough to wield a purple lightsaber, which, as we know, purple is a mix of red and blue.
Yeah, he was worthy.
Awesome. Some items too, maybe they're not about some growth element or character trait. Maybe they're just things that are so intrinsically connected to that character that they just define that character. Whenever you see that character, you expect to see that item. And so again, let's go back to our Marvel Universe example. Here's 3 examples. And we saw some interesting details around this. There's Mjolnir for Thor. We brought that up. Iron Man's armor, right? And then finally, Captain America's shield. And Mark, when you and I were doing some show prep for this, we noticed some interesting things about this. Isn't it interesting how in the third movie, all three of these characters lose whatever that thing is.
Yeah, that is a fair point. They did kind of lose them, as if Marvel's trying to tell you that maybe it's the character, the internal, that's the person who defines that character.
That's right. Iron Man says, I am Iron Man, after he blows up all his armor in Iron Man 3. And Thor's father, says to his son, who's lamenting the loss of a hammer, are you the god of hammers? And that's when Thor powers up and becomes the hero he needs to be at the end of that one.
But hey, Ben, what did they immediately have to do in the next movie?
Oh, they had to go get those things back. Yeah.
So
Thor
he's
goes to
got
build another
hammers,
hammer.
apparently.
That's right. Thor goes to build another hammer. Iron Man keeps making some new armor. And Captain America, well, he finally gets his shield back too.
Yeah, and we're all better for it.
That's right. Well, and those are very expressive of those characters in a lot of great ways. So that's the first thing, right? Items help define your character. Sometimes they'll help you show growth. Sometimes they'll just be associated with the character in some strong way. But then also, items can also be about the story and the plot. So let's talk about the story for a moment. How do items help us express themes in a story, Mark?
Well, when we brought this kind of question up, the first thing I thought of was, it's not irony that Conan's Atlantean blade clashes with his father's stolen blade, who's wielded by Thulsa Doom in the great Conan movie. It's his father's sword that shatters. And if you remember his father in the beginning of the movie talking to him about the riddle of steel, what is the riddle of steel? They never answered it then. But at some point in the film, Thulsa Doom says the riddle of steel. He says, what is steel compared to the hand that wields it?
All right.
And so when those two go head to head and one of them breaks, that is an item expressing a theme in the entire arc of that movie.
Interesting. I'm going to have to think about that one for a while. I think that's a deep cut. So for those of you that haven't seen it.
Speaking of deep cuts, what does he do with that broken blade of his father?
Well, it turns out that he still uses that sword. He uses it to behead Tulsa Doom at the end of the movie.
Yeah.
Spoilers. It's 1982, but spoilers.
That's a deep cut.
The riddle of steel is answered. Yeah. Hey, look, go back and watch Conan the Barbarian from 1982. It's great. It's
fantastic.
one of our favorite go-to movies for the sword and sorcery genre. Early Arnold Schwarzenegger, nothing like it.
And Ben, what to you? Can you think of a storyline that might have been enhanced by a weapon that expressed a theme in it?
Yeah, there is, when you look at the original Return of the Jedi, I think there's a lot of our younger listeners who might not remember that at the original time that was about to be released, they had a very late breaking change to the title of that. And it stopped being Revenge of the Jedi and became Return of the Jedi, presumably because people, maybe George Lucas, thought that might be too dark. And there's a lot of moments in that movie that tease, is Luke going to succumb to the dark side? His training's not complete.
Yeah, he kind of starts the movie like in all black, and there's a kind of an aura of like, oh, this is a new Luke Skywalker, right?
Yeah, he's very much more self-assured. He's not wrecked and ruined after the battle with Darth Vader at the end of Empire Strikes Back. He's very confident. He's got a new lightsaber. We see that early on in the first act of the movie. So now flash forward to the end of the movie. It's Luke Skywalker, Darth Vader, the Emperor in the throne room, and the Emperor is baiting him. The Emperor is trying to get him to give into his hatred. And it looks for all the world like he's going to do it. He grabs his lightsaber from the Emperor's hand. He slashes out, and his blade is blocked by his father's blade. And so there's a great lightsaber battle that ensues. And Luke Skywalker's exercising constant aggression, beating his father down. And finally, he wins, and Darth Vader is beaten. And so he looks at his father. His father's defeated. He's helpless. The Emperor's looking at him saying, now come take your father's place at my side. He casts away his lightsaber because he realizes that aggression, violence, this is not how he's going to win. And that, in fact, by mastering that temptation to give in to his hate and cast that final stroke on his father and kill him, he has become the Jedi. And that's what he says. He says, you failed, Your Highness. I am a Jedi like my father before me.
That was a powerful moment. And I don't think anybody watching that originally had any sense of like it was going to go down like that.
Well, I certainly didn't expect the lightning coming out of the Emperor's fingers. That was unprecedented.
And I want to apologize right now for spoiler warnings, but like, if you hadn't seen those movies,
I mean, it is 40 years ago.
yeah.
I think our nerd audience is probably into it. So we've talked about how items can help define characters. We've talked about how items can express themes. And then items can also be the focal points of stories. And there's a word that they use for this called the MacGuffin. The MacGuffin is the thing that you chase in a story. It's the thing that is the center point of the story's plot and action. And you could probably take whole screenwriting seminars on this. We'll certainly have a lot more to say about MacGuffins in the future. But we're going to give you 3 examples of MacGuffins, and we want to just talk about 2 things that they do that are important. And then we'll leave that topic for today. 3 examples of great MacGuffins. Number 1 is the Ark of the Covenant from Raiders of the Lost Ark. Number 2 would be the Ring of Power from Lord of the Rings. And then number 3 could be the Mind Stone from the Marvel Cinematic Universe. So 2 things to think about MacGuffins, and you can think about how this plays out with these 3 examples. First of all, MacGuffins underpin the stakes of the story. Mark, if the Nazis get the Ark of the Covenant, what happens?
Doom. Doom falls upon the world.
That's right. They carry it before their armies that will be victorious, presumably. The Ring of Power. If Sauron gets the Ring of Power back, what happens?
Doom.
More doom.
Upon all of us.
Doom. That's right. And finally, if Thanos gets the Mind Stone, as indeed he effectively does, of course, he's going to snap and put half the universe out. So MacGuffins really tell you about how bad things are going to get if this goes wrong. And it doesn't have to be cosmic, right? There's other stories. The MacGuffin is originally named for things in like Raymond Chandler books, things like the Maltese Falcon or the stolen treasure of something. And it's just one of these things that, look, unless that's found, somebody's going to die or go to prison because they were thought to be the person who last saw it or something like that. So make sure your MacGuffin sets the stakes of the story in the right way. Now, secondly, Mark, MacGuffins drive the action. And so using those 3 examples, how do those MacGuffins that we talked about drive the action of their respective stories?
Well, we're talking about, in Lord of the Rings, casting the ring away was the entire plot of the books. Recovering the Ark, of course, was the focal point of Indiana Jones. All these things are pointing the characters on a path to find these items, recover them, and who knows the next step. Could be destroy them, could be to secret them away. And then, of course, in the Marvel movies, Thanos, the Mind Stone was actually in one of the characters. And by removing it, he destroyed Vision.
Well, and we talked about how that's a great character-defining moment. I mean, Vision's like, this is okay. This is what has to happen. You need to do this. And it's, in some sense, sort of the apex of his character. It's really the last time we see him in the way that we'd always seen him. There's versions of them that come up in WandaVision, but it's definitely not the same character we knew.
And not only defining for him, but also for Wanda, who had to take that stone out of him.
So MacGuffins are really driving the action of the story, whether it's pulling you further and further toward a land that you're trying to avoid, like Mordor, or whether you're searching for this thing, whatever it is, the MacGuffin is something that pulls you further into the stakes of the story.
Lastly, let's just talk about how fun magic items are. I mean, that's reason enough, right? So we've talked about how they can help tell a character's story. We can talk about them being MacGuffins, but let's also just talk about them being fun. Ben, what are some examples of maybe some awesome, fun items that you would love to get your hands on?
I think there's a whole category here, what I would call travel items. And I'm going to just name 3 things here, right? Number 1 would be Harry Potter's broomstick. Number 2 would be Aladdin's flying carpet. And number 3 would be the Rocketeer's jetpack.
Oh, God, I want that jetpack so bad.
Yeah. Yeah. So all 3 of those are just wonderful ways that you could just get around and have your own personal flying ability.
Those are really fun. And even a temporary item that maybe it's just a one-use item could be a lot of fun. If you're playing a Western game and you get a chance to jump on a Gatling gun and just go to town on stuff, you can't tell me that's not fun.
That's great. I think temporary items are a great way of not blowing up the balance of your campaign, but also giving players a moment or two occasionally that they can do something really unprecedented and awesome.
Yeah. That maybe they pick up the weapon of the boss bad guy and use it against them, and they're feeling the power surge in there, through the weapon, and how exciting that could be. You're giving them just a brief taste of it, but those are scenes that are going to stick in their minds for years to come.
Absolutely. Okay, so these can be amazingly fun things because they give you new, profound powers, things that even in a fantastic or superheroic world, you might not normally be able to do. So when we're giving these things out, though, we've got to be careful. I know one example is when we first started playing 5th edition D&D, we started giving out magic items related to people's armor class about the same frequency we'd been doing in earlier versions.
Yeah.
I quickly realized that was a mistake because it wasn't scaling the same way past editions had. So it turns out that you've got to be pretty cautious sometimes when you're getting into that. So Mark, talk about the things we need to be cautious about.
Well, first and foremost, we need to be thoughtful about game balance among the party, but also, thinking about how this affects the encounter difficulty and the threats that you as a GM are going to want to pose to that group. How does that item affect those encounters? How does it affect the balance between your players? Let's talk a little bit about some of that balance. Give me an example of player balance, Ben.
Well, so what if it turns out that because you've handed out the wrong item that somebody all of a sudden can do a lot more damage than anybody else in the party? Or you'll remember the example a moment ago where we were giving out armor like it was an earlier edition, and it turned out that was making players much too tough to hit.
Mm-hmm.
All of a sudden what starts to happen is that you've actually got to level up the opposition and the challenges. And if only one person has that capability or that power or those extra hit points or whatever it is, all the rest of the players are going to start getting swamped.
Yeah, it definitely can be a problem. So you got to be really thoughtful about what kind of items we're giving out. Also, does the item step on the toes of another player?
We have a few interesting examples of that.
Yeah, I've seen situations where GMs have given out things like belts of strength or something of that nature, maybe a headband of intellect. And what sometimes happens, it ends up on another player in the group, and next thing you know, he's stronger than the character who's defined themselves as being the strong man of a group. Now that character has to redefine themselves. I'm no longer the strongest person in this party.
So that tank that's got all the hit points and all the strength, they're keyed up and they're ready to be in the front line, is now feeling like, gosh, somebody just gave the rogue a belt of ogre strength and a cloak of displacement, and now they're doing my job for me.
I've been doing chin-ups and pull-ups for I've been doing push-ups and pull-ups for the last 20 years, and this person just put on a belt?
That's so not fair.
Think about that. That can really affect a person's morale.
Yeah, you can end up basically taking away the things that players like about their characters, and you don't want to do that. Relatedly, some items also may confer abilities that break the progression of that character. And Mark, this is one where I have a confession to make. This was something I did in a game we played. I gave a character a dragon mask, and this dragon mask, because I wasn't being very careful about seeing what was going on further down the line with this character's level progression, I gave this dragon mask an ability that he ended up getting later anyway. And I can't remember if it was even a better version of that ability, but because we were co-GMing, this ended up becoming a problem for you because I just kind of let him have that and he had fun with it. And then when it came time for you to GM, you had to have the hard conversation. So tell me about what that was like.
Well, I realized that the character, like you said, the character got that ability at a later level, basically through his class. So I had to kind of have that conversation with that player, and I had to do some horse trading. There's no doubt about it. And I'll tell you what, Sean, if you're out there, you drive a hard bargain. But, these are things you just have to talk over with your player, and just, you got to realize that you made a mistake, and you just got to try your best to fix it. And you may not get an equitable trade. It might just be that you have to give a little bit more than just to make the situation right.
So it may turn out that there are a lot of items you can give that enhance or interact with a character's abilities at different levels in different ways. And you don't want to preempt a character's natural progression through the game with the abilities that an item gives them. Let's now talk about how items can also start changing the encounters you're going to run. So we've talked about game balance. We've talked about whether or not this creates challenges for the players amongst each other, but also for you as a GM. items can be a way of shortcutting certain kinds of challenges. We've got some examples of different kinds of shortcuts. Mark, what are the shortcuts we should be thinking about?
Well, travel shortcuts is a big one. Maybe you gave out those boots of flight or those jetpacks a little too early. Maybe they had access to those Star Trek transporters and they just kind of got around your carefully designed, map a little too easily. So think about those travel shortcuts. Do you want to give that item out too early?
There's also knowledge shortcuts. So the crystal ball or those somehow mystical Star Trek sensors again that can pick out 3 milligrams of magnesium on a planet that shouldn't be there from all over that planet. I don't know how they do that. It seems to me a little bit broken, but the fact is there's a lot of items that can give characters a shortcut through all the mystery that you might have had teed up for them that might answer questions that you were hoping they would take longer to resolve. And so just be aware if you're going to do that you need to have ways of either thwarting those items in certain cases, although I don't think that would be my first choice because you don't want to make players feel like their items are undermined in some way. And there's a third category we talked about, Mark.
I guess this might be a little bit under the level of travel shortcuts, but environmental shortcuts, underwater, outer space. These are all environments that are meant to be like a danger or a threat. And if you just have something that can undermine that entire aspect of maybe your carefully crafted campaign and they get that too early, again, that could cause some problems with your storyline and the encounters that you want to have.
Yeah, so the way I think about these environmental shortcuts is these are spaces that if your characters are in there without some kind of a special item, they're going to die. Being at the molten heart of the earth, being underwater, being in outer space, these are all hazardous spaces. And so items in that case that you'll need to protect yourself, those could be the subject of adventures all on their own. A spaceship, a vac suit, all of the things that go with that. Think about when you want those kinds of things to be available to the players and what kinds of ways you want them to earn that stuff, which is true, I think, of all of these kinds of items. And so, Mark, think about this too. Like, at what point in the party's progression should they have that capability? I think that's a relevant part of the story.
I mean, that really is just up to the GM to make that call. At what point does he want to introduce those themes? And at what point does he want those themes to be obstacles to be overcome by means of items? So just keep in mind when you're designing your longer game where you might want to have them be able to maybe, step out into that environment or take that shortcut, or have that knowledge shortcut where you kind of feel okay that the story's been unfolded.
And don't forget Mark's example a moment ago where he had to do some horse trading to take that item back. It is always more difficult to take items away from players once they've earned them, once they have them, once they own them. And so that's another reason why you want to be very careful at what point you introduce those items to the party.
Let's also make a point here, Ben, that memorable items are not commodities.
To help you understand what we mean by that, Mark, I want you to imagine that a long time ago, your father gave you this special sword. He had crafted it from star metal, fallen from the sky.
My dad?
He did. And he, a blacksmith, forged this into an incredible blade. Its edge has seen no notch. It is bright as the day it was forged. So you're getting the story. It's got this amazing value associated with this wonderful story connected to it. It is a +1 item. What happens when you find that +2 sword that you just dug out of some dungeon in a couple levels?
Sorry, Pop.
Yeah. Dad's out of luck.
Dad's out of luck.
Full. We don't want that. We want items that are amazing, they're memorable, and that they preserve that value through your game as often as they can. So remember, anything that people look at just in terms of stats, and that's all they're thinking about, that item is a commodity. There's no reason to keep a +1 sword when a +2 sword is there.
And there's no emotional attachment to the item. All that narrative about, my father smithing this weapon for me and handing it down and it just being a +1 sword, that just does not fulfill my requirement for a magic item. It just doesn't do it. The +1 doesn't match up to that backstory.
Okay, so I think this means that we need to make sure our listeners don't leave this discussion without hearing a little bit about how to tune up their items. So how do we keep things memorable? How do we make them not be just commodities? Mark, items have a story. Tell us about that.
Well, they do. They got a beginning, how it's made and what for. They have a middle. The character receives this item and its uses in the story. And that item has an end. Is it recreated? Is it destroyed? Or is it stolen? So what is your item story?
Yeah, it's a great question. So think about your item story. Think about where it comes from, how it's used, and how it's finished.
And is this the right moment in the story to give the character an item?
Are they ready for that item right now? Do they need it right now? One of the things I remember, for example, in the Lord of the Rings movies, this is a change that Peter Jackson made, and we all noticed it in Fellowship of the Ring, was Anduril was not reforged.
Oh, yeah.
And so a lot of us that were Tolkien readers thought, hey, what's going on here? He should have that amazing sword before he leaves Rivendell and goes on the quest. And in the movies, we don't see it until he's about to traverse the paths of the dead. And his identity as a king is critical to his survival in that deathless place. So that's a moment when Aragorn needs to have his new sword.
And Ben, how might you bequeath this item in a memorable way?
Yeah, is this something that they happen to find along the road? That's the story with Sting. Is this something that's granted to them by some mentor, like Luke Skywalker gets his lightsaber from Obi-Wan Kenobi? Or you may remember the example in Thor. You were talking about how the first thing Thor does in the next time we see him after Ragnarok is he goes out to forge a new hammer, Stormbringer, which will become this great weapon that he goes out to Thanos with.
Quite possibly the best magic item crafting scene I've ever seen on film. It gave me goosebumps.
Yeah. Yeah, that's not just forging a weapon. That's forging the weapon in a star.
Yeah, and it just had such a personal attachment with that Groot's arm.
Yeah.
You know, it's just powerful.
Really good stuff. So one of the things that does happen, though, right, is that characters grow and items, of course, do they grow too? How do they grow, Mark?
Well, they can be remade. They could be empowered. You got to think if these players are really attached to those items and they don't necessarily, they're not so long to give them up. How do we encourage that weapon to live anew?
Yeah, one of the games that we played, you and I, your character, I think, had a spear of some kind. It was like a +1 spear. And you really liked that weapon. And so we actually had a whole storyline where you went to a dwarven city and they actually reforged it for you and they gave it extra features and things like that. And
Reforged it to something that wasn't +1.
yeah, that's right. Reforged into something more powerful. And so what's cool, right? You have the ability as a GM to change the stats on these things. You can change how they're used. You can change anything about them. The important point is you want to tell a great story around that. Don't just go to the dwarven city and be like, well, they take your weapon and they do some stuff to it and then here it is and it's got these new mechanics.
But like we said at the top here of this section, your weapon also has a story and stories have an end. So Ben, when and how do you give up this item? How does this weapon end?
Yeah, I think there can be a lot of ways you can do that. One thing you can do, this is the gentle out, I think, for an item, is you could bequeath an item to an NPC, to a sidekick, or to somebody who's apprenticing for you and say, you know, this was the sword I started with, and I think you're about old enough to take it on now, young man. Go ahead and carry this well.
It could also be broken in a powerful story moment.
Yeah, and that titanic clash with the arch nemesis, not the final one, but the one where you meet him for the first time and you're feeling pretty confident and you go to roll the dice. And if I'm an awful GM, an evil GM, and Mark, you know that I am, when that enemy rolls a 20, I am very likely to break that weapon if I can.
Yeah, and if you're in a storytelling game and players recognize that moment as it is, hoping they give a little bit of latitude and they're able to seize that moment and see it for a storytelling moment.
I definitely think that, like a lot of the other things we've talked about, when it comes to things that could be a hard pill for the players to swallow or that you want to make sure they're on board with, definitely have the conversation ahead of time. Don't spring it on your player that, oh, hey, now your cool sword that's the center point of your character's power, it's just broken. That would be evil in a different way.
All right, Ben. In conclusion, well, not quite in conclusion. We got one more section to talk about here. Ben, I broke my game. I introduced an item, and it's broken. I broke my whole game. What do I do?
I'm glad you asked, Mark. It's not irretrievable, but the first thing to do is talk to your players. And just like when we talked about breaking the rules a little bit or house ruling things, fudging dice a little bit, this is one of these things where if you're learning how to be a GM and all of a sudden you realize you've stepped wrong, you've given your players items that are inappropriate for the kind of adventures that you're in right now, you can always talk to the players and say, listen, guys, this is not going to work out. I don't have a way to challenge you at the level that you guys are right now without really breaking this game. And so at that point, be ready to do some of that horse trading that we talked about earlier. The other thing that's possible is you can just retire the item. Find a way to either fix the item. Maybe it's downgraded. If it's a paladin sword, perhaps they do something unjust or something like that, and you could then just have the sword essentially downgrade itself. Maybe you could break the item, or you can do other things that essentially change its characteristics to be suitable for the level of character progression that you've got.
But if you have been thoughtful about your items, if you've given it some real consideration as you're designing these items, hopefully this thing won't happen. Hopefully you won't have to come to that point. I'm hoping you learn from the many, many mistakes that Ben and I have made when it comes to introducing items into our game. And I'm really hoping that this tune-up is useful and helpful for you in your games.
Exactly. We are really keen to have your thoughts and feedback. If you have anything to share, if you have comments on this, or if you'd like to send us an idea for something you'd like to tune up, go ahead and reach out to us at tabletoptuneup@gmail.com. Anything you do as a game master is something that we'd love to hear about. And if you've got requests for anything from world building to table management and anything else the GM does that you would like our thoughts or insight about, ways that we can help you tune that up, we'd love to hear from you.
And we ran a little long today, so we're going to actually not have a tune-up tonight.
But we would love to hear from you, and we would love to tune up your ideas in our next episode and the episodes to come. Until then, keep those dice rolling.